9. Good evening, everyone. Thank the Lord for giving me another opportunity to share God's word with you. And this evening, we are going to look at Psalm 43. We are going to look at, there are only 5 verses in it. Let's all turn to Psalm 43 and keep it open. So as we go through each verse, we'll be able to appreciate what the psalmist is trying to tell us. So some of you might have some kind of title there, like in my Bible version, I have prayer to God in time of trouble. Prayer to God in time of trouble. So I would like to give a title to this sermon as Christian suffering that to Christians joy. Christian suffering to Christians joy. So we can see that in these 5 verses, how a Christian suffering and what is its suffering, and how a Christian's suffering has been converted to joy. Right. So we all know that some of the verses in 42, 43 are also present in 42 chapter, because we know that from the book of Psalms is consisting of 5 books, and this is the beginning of book 2, Psalm 42. It's the beginning of book 2, and from Psalm 42 onwards, the 7 Psalms were written by the sons of Korah. So we see that, and every book in Psalms, it ends with a doxology or a praise unto God. So if you look at Psalm 41, it's a doxology or praise to God. Right. So we all remember who Korah was, right? He was a rebellious man who led many people to rebel against God, right? In the time of Moses, and he perished in his rebellion along with the people that he got support from. And we see that this lineage and this hereditary that we see, that the authors write themselves as sons of Korah. It's fascinating to see that, okay, people can associate with a great ancestry, right? Oh, my grandfather did this, or my forefather was such a great man. We are the descendants of Abraham, the father of faith, right? And such and such. But we see here that the sons of Korah, remain to identify themselves as sons of Korah, in which we see God's grace and mercy, right? Even though Korah perished, his sons were left behind, and they were chosen to serve and guard the tabernacle. Actually, they were appointed to guard the tabernacle, where actually his father rebelled against God. So we see God's provision and mercy there in their family, and they always want to identify with that aspect of their forefather. So let's go to so there are 3 points that I would like to highlight here in this 5 verses. Firstly, we can see how the world suffers a Christian, how the world suffers a Christian, right? We are all in this world, we are all in this sinful world and this fallen world. And what happens when a Christian tries to live in this world, and how do we face this suffering? Christians always face suffering at different degrees, and to different areas of life, right? And secondly, we are going to look at God's light and truth. And thirdly, Christians exceeding joy. 3 points. So we all have gone through difficult times, right? Especially not because of something we did, but something that other people have done to us wrongly, correct? We can all raise our hands in that aspect. And even a child would say, my friend in front of teacher said that, he bit me first instead of I bit him first, right? And they also suffered some consequences. So because of the sinful nature of man, even from a young age, because of our sinful nature, people tend to hurt each other at different degrees. And as we interact with the people around us, and people who are unbelievers specifically, they always, not everyone, but most of them would, all the troubles that we get from them are, they are in different categories that we see, they are of two different aspects. And when we go through such difficult time, especially when a painful time or a difficult time. What do we feel? The first thing that we see is God is not the first person that comes to our mind, correct? It is always my hurt, my pain, my suffering, isn't it? But the antidote or the medicine for such kind of suffering that we experience at the hands of unbelievers is actually with God and in the presence of God. That's what this psalm is trying to highlight. Instead of going to God, we try to revel in our pain. We try to gain self-sympathy or gain pity from others by explaining our situation. But it's the last thing in our mind that we go to God. But we see here a different pattern that is set before us, that the psalmist, that is the sons of Korah, in their experience. We don't know much about the sons of Korah from the Bible because there are not many narratives about them. But we see here that the sons of Korah also went through such kinds of experiences. And the first response would be, in verse 2, we see that, why do you cast me off? Why do I go mourning because of the oppression of the enemy? We feel falsely, wrongly, that God has left us, God is no longer with us, and we are suffering and we are mourning, and this mourning is going on, and we are alone in this. Right? The oppression of the enemy means someone who is continually showing some kind of cruelty, especially people who are in higher posts than us. Right? That's what this word implies. Right? How untrue this is, right? How untrue is this experience? The first experience that we get as believers is that God is far away from me. He has forgotten about me, and my pain takes precedence. It takes my whole thing, takes over my whole thing. Okay. So let's go to the first point: how the world suffers a Christian. How the world suffers a Christian. Here, the psalmist goes to God and says, the first thing that comes to mind is he goes to God, which is a good thing. But when he goes to God, he says, plead my case against an ungodly nation. Deliver me from the deceitful and unjust man. He's asking God to judge that person, right? Lord, this person has wronged me. This person has, gossiped against me or maligned my name, right? Or did something bad against me or gave me some kind of damage. Lord, make sure that this person gets it, right? Right? That's the first response of the psalmist. And this person, the ungodly nation, is like the magnitude of the people around of the psalmist. Right? There are many people like that who are going on hurting these Christians. So the word deceit means concealing or misrepresentation of truth. So they tell us something, but they means they have something else in our heart, right? So the narrative that we have read in 1 Samuel 24, we see that Saul is very repentant that he tried to kill David. Right? And he says, oh, my son, and he gives a nice, he butters him off and he says, nothing will happen. But when we go to chapter 26, he's again trying to kill David, right? He's being deceitful over there, right? His feelings are not sincere. It was just at that moment that this thing had passed, and actually in his heart, he still wanted to kill David, isn't it? And we also see that Saul's behavior was unjust, an unjust man. We see that a behavior that is morally wrong and unfair. We suffer unfairly at the hands of people, isn't it? And we try to be moral, we try to follow God's commandments, but these people are not moral, and they hurt us in immoral ways, right? And things that he does to this Christian, to this believer, is they're willful, they're active and strong. They're willful and active and strong. Okay, they thought of this, they thought of this plan, plotted it, and executed it. And this suffering is what we see sadly in the world around us, and we are not immune to the world that we are living in, right? Among sinners and among unbelievers, especially in a country like us. Like we are very, very, we are a minority. Most of the people that are around us are not believers, and their moral compass is broken because they don't know God. And not all of them, but many of them would definitely, the sinful nature would play out. But we have God who can vindicate us and plead our cause. Right? He can help execute justice. Definitely, He's going to execute justice at the day of judgment, isn't it? God is going to bring into light the action of the wrong actions of every man, and He's going to judge rightfully, justly. And when we see this life of David, David invokes this psalm actually in verse 50. Therefore, let the Lord be judge and judge between me and you, and see and plead my case and deliver me out of your hand. Here, David is asking for deliverance, and he's invoking God's name. He's saying that Saul, you therefore let Lord be judge and judge between you and me. See and plead my case and deliver me out of. You can see here that God had delivered David's life here at this point of time, isn't it? So we see God's deliverance here in David's life, but this thing is temporary, and Saul is going to try and kill him again. So the next question is, why does the world hate Christians? Is there any implicit reason? I have told you that there is a sinful behavior and their moral compass is broken, and they try to hurt us. And we are also living with our sinful nature. We also hurt people, but we repent of it. But what is the fundamental reason behind which unbelievers try to hurt believers? Is there any natural cause that happens?
Because their life will reflect goodness, righteousness compared to their life.
Right.
So there are like that means when he's living a righteous life, and show that righteous life will show his sinful life. Right? Correct. So because of that also one reason they will get angry. There are another, but in David case, like he always he kept the Lord's commandments. Day and night he kept his commandments and judgment, as I think he did the righteous judgment to the people. So because of that also enemies are getting angry, not with David.
Yes. Thank you. So Anna mentioned that because of her righteous behavior, because of her Christian behavior, and it would show the mistakes of other people. Right? What we are doing is right, and then what the other person is doing is wrong, and that offends that person, offends a sinful person. And there is another fundamental reason that Jesus gives in John chapter 15, 18 to 20. If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you are of the world would love its fruit. Yet because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Because we are chosen by Christ, because we belong to God, there is a supernatural separation, right? People who belong to God and people who don't belong to God, and they will always they will always be in enmity with God and His people. There is a separation at salvation itself. Right? So we are a different group of people altogether, and this invokes hatred. Right? They hated Christ, and therefore they will definitely hate us. So we see that to some degree or another, the world will unjustly and deceitfully hurt us and suffer us, bring us into suffering. This could be from our friends. This could happen through our family members, and this could happen through our co-workers or superiors at workplace, and even governments. Right? The world will always try to suffer the church and the Christians. So what should our response be? Should we invoke God and ask Him to ask Him for fire and brimstone to be on their heads, to fall on their heads? How did Christ respond? What was Christ's response? They don't know what they're doing. He is forgiving, right? He's forgiving, and we see in 1 Peter 2:2, when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to Him who judges justly. Right? We see that our first response in suffering should be to entrust ourselves to God. Because of our maybe the sinful nature, we might try to get back at them, isn't it? We are tempted to get back at these people. Right? If you say X, I will immediately go with the Y. If you do this tactic, I will play this tactic against you. Isn't it? That is how our old nature will try to tempt us to get that person and get hold of that person. Right? I will show you when the time comes who I am. These are the things that do cross our minds from time to time. Who do you think you are? Okay. So all of these thoughts, we are not immune to these thoughts because of our sinful nature. But we see Christ that when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten. As Brother rightly pointed out, he also went an extra step and he forgave the people who actually hung him to the cross. So, since Christ entrusted himself to him who judges justly, we should also look to God in prayer and entrust ourselves. The world will think otherwise. Okay, this person can't do anything. Okay, he's just like a lamb. He's an easy target for us. That's how the world would interpret us. This guy has no uh, what is it? Hot blood in his veins, right? Right? We have nice terminologies in Telugu. So this fellow is incapable of anything, right? He can't do anything. He's an easy target. But what we do is when we imitate Christ, our response is much more stronger. Our response is towards the eternity and the omnipotent and powerful God. So when we look at this verse, we see here that the psalmist recognizes in verse 2, "For you are the God of my strength." He remembers from past that God had been his strength. God had delivered him from difficult situations. And he's slowly thinking about, he's coming from judging these people, God judging these people, to realizing that, okay, God has been my strength. But why do you cast me off, God? I don't see your strength now. He's starting to doubt whether God is with him or not. Why do I go mourning because of the oppression of the enemy? There has been continual attacks against me. That's what this oppression word means. People are continuously taunting me. They're always getting at me. And I am mourning. So there is a deep seated pain and suffering that I'm going. I'm crying, Lord. Why did you leave? Why did you forsake? And if you see here, the third verse, "Oh, send out your light and your truth. Let them lead me." He's asking for God's guidance in this situation, right? It has been too much now. Things have gone to the maximum extent that this person can handle, psalmist can handle. And he's asking God, "Go send out your light and your truth. Lead them to me. Let them lead me. Let them bring me to your holy hill and to your tabernacle." The first thing is, since he feels that he's cut off from God, he wants to get back to God and get an answer. Right? He wants to get back to God to get his strength from God. And what does this special term, light and truth, mean? Normally, light is used for guidance. Right? The light is used for guidance. So if you want to go and travel, we should have some light. Without street lights, even today, these days, with our headlights on, it's very difficult to drive in the nights. You can imagine pre-electricity days where it would be really impossible to travel at nights. Yeah, without helping. So he's asking, Lord, guide me. So light points to God's guidance, and truth corresponds to God's faithfulness. This is the picture, Old Testament picture that we have in these twin words. So he's asking, Lord, guide me there. I know you're faithful. Please guide me. Take me by the hand and guide me. And he's because of his past experiences, he knows that God has guided him in the past. In Psalm 9:1, the psalmist says, "I will praise you, O Lord, with my whole heart. I will tell of all your marvelous works." The psalmist is, when we remember God's faithfulness from the past, it will help us a lot to overcome the situation. God did deliver me. God did comfort me in the situation. God sent a person to comfort me. But God did strengthen me through his word. And many people prayed for me in the situation. So all of these things, when we bring it to our remembrance, when we see in the past of God's faithfulness, we will not respond with this kind of behavior. So when we remind ourselves how God showed his grace, right, from the moment of our salvation and even to this day, how many mercies, right, how many blessings he has given us, how many times he has comforted us, how many times he has strengthened us, how many times he has uplifted our soul. When we think about all those terms, we remember of God's faithfulness, and we can now again trust God in the situation, and we can entrust ourselves to Him. So even in this present time, we have to remember that we need to go to God's presence, right? We have an access to go to God's presence. In Hebrews 4:15 and 16, we read, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses." God is not very distant from us, and He's seated on the definitely He's seated, but He is not disconnected from us. He is not only transcendental, but He is also immanent. That He intimately works with us and within us, isn't it? So, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. We see of our high priest Jesus Christ, who can sympathize with our weaknesses. He knows our weaknesses. He understands our suffering because he went through the same thing, right? To the maximum possible extent, to maximum possible degree on the cross of Calvary. So let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. So whenever we need God's mercy and grace and help, that is the time we need to go to God's throne and ask Him for help. Don't take things in our own hands. Don't try to handle things in a sinful way. I'm not talking about our rights where we have our rights and we have to stand up for what is right. I'm not talking about those situations. But when we are personally attacked, right, unfairly and unjustly, and we cannot do anything about it, and things pile up, and things go on for a long time, it puts a lot of strain on us. Our family lives are affected, right? Our relationships are affected. Even thinking will get affected. It gets clouded. That's why this word light has been used. And finally, when we go to God, we see here that let them, in verse 3, and let them bring me to your holy hill and to your tabernacle. So tabernacle represented the place where God was present. God's presence was there. Then I will go to the altar of God. There is a change. There is a shift here in the psalmist's words. To God my exceeding joy, and on the harp I will praise you, O God my God. You see, from morning he was crying, he was in pain, he was in suffering. But now we see in 4th verse, he's praising God, and there is an element of exceeding joy. There's an extraordinary transition that has happened. So we see that in David's life, even though his wife left him, his goods, his house, and his earthly comforts were destroyed at some point, when he comes to God's temple, he would forget everything else because of the presence of God. Not because God gives forgetfulness to the person, but God is so magnificent. God is so delightful. When we are in His presence, it's so delightful and it is so joyful. Right? We have some people that were very pleasant and joyful to meet, right? Very calming, and even if you pick up a small child, we feel so relaxed. We feel so comforted, and that is just a taste. But when we go to God's presence, we can find the true delight and the true joy in the presence of God, and we can delight. And this joy is not a simple joy, but it's an exceeding joy. Exceeding joy. Right? We see here. Then I will go to the altar of God to sacrifice thanksgiving offerings, peace offerings to God. And then to God my exceeding joy, and on the harp I will praise you. So this word exceeding joy and this harp, they're used one in celebratory mode. He was in suffering, he was mourning. Now he's in celebratory festive mode, and he wants to get the most happiest making musical instrument, and he wants to sing praises to God. And this person has changed entirely. Even in this short span, we see when he remembers God's faithfulness, God's justice, everything has changed. When he goes to God's presence, everything has changed. And now he's talking to himself. He's giving counseling to himself. Why are you cast down, O my soul? Why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall yet praise Him, the help of my countenance and my God. You can see here, this person's soul, he still has this baggage within him, but it has become insignificant, very small in the presence of God. Earlier, his problems, his suffering, his pains clouded his mind. and his attitude and all the things and all his relations. Now, in the presence of God, they become very insignificant. So, this is Christian's exceeding joy. The Christian's exceeding joy is, if you want to travel from suffering to joy, it is God's presence that will take you there. Also, I'm not including all the elements that will help us rejoice in the Lord, but this is one thing that this psalm talks about. So, as we have meditated this word, let us always remind ourselves that only in the presence of God we will find true joy, exceeding joy, and we will delight in His presence because of who He is, because of His mercy, grace, His goodness, and His kindness to us. And if you are suffering and you don't know who God is, you don't have access to the throne of grace because you don't know Christ, then you're missing out on the supreme joy and delight that God can give you. Isn't it? So you're missing out this wonderful joy, and you'll be in your suffering always. You'll always be in your pain and sufferings. That only God can deliver you. So if you are suffering and if you are in pain, it is only if you enter God's presence through the blood of Christ, through repentance, in faith, in the name of Jesus Christ, will you be able to find exceeding joy. So as we have seen today, let us remind ourselves of God's goodness, His guidance, His faithfulness from the past, and also the justices that He is going to execute. It's not in our hands. Let us entrust ourselves to God. Let us not situations and circumstances overrule us, but let God and His justice and His goodness and His mercy overrule our thoughts.